Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'll be going over some of the project files for this animation. This is a YouTube intro I did for a Twitch streamer named Hera, so without further ado, let's get into the project. I was actually quite organized. You can see everything's labeled over here. Let's just start off with the first group, which is the RAM itself. By the way, for those of you who are not familiar, this is what the unit looks like in-game, and this was one of the reference photos I was working with. Here you can see this was the camera angle from this side. If you jump to the other side, things aren't as nice looking because they weren't in view, so it's not too necessary. So these textures, if we jump over to the shading panel, these textures actually started off as fully procedural, and then I added some ambient occlusion of my own and some dirt and grime around the edges that I painted on in Blender using the texture paint workspace. So you can see this is just a noise texture stretched out. Added the ambient occlusion, really made a difference. The logo is chilling over there. Again, these horns have this lava effect, which actually moves a little bit. The W factor is animated along just to give it some extra features, which is cool. Just a quick tip on the W slider. In Blender, when using a noise texture, if you change it to 4D, you'll get an extra slider, which is the W slider. This effectively just changes the seed. So you have the same parameters of the scale and the distortion that you chose before, but just the seed will be different, which is nice. This was actually a lot more procedural using an array modifier for all of these, etc., up until right at the end where I applied everything, which is cool. I was actually really happy during stream when I figured out about hook modifiers. Oops, if we undo that. So if we grab this midsection over here and we move it along, you can see that these straps holding it move along as well. The way that was done is that, let's just hide a few more things. Each of these have their bottom point. I did Control H to hook to a new object. So there's actually empties there, which are then parented to this. So just to briefly explain hooks, let's say we have an object, Suzanne, and to animate this object is quite simple. We can add keyframes and move the whole object about. But what if we want to edit the individual vertices? To do that, we could add an armature and bones, and that's a whole complicated process. But what if we just say want to move the eyes out? So we could separate them into separate objects, but an easier way or an alternative way to do it is to use hooks. So let's say we select both of these eyes. We can press Control H. This will hook. You can select hook to new object. This will now basically parent these vertices to this empty. The good thing about this is now in object mode, we can now move around this empty and animate the eyes. So now we can insert a keyframe here, insert a keyframe here, and you can see we're moving around the vertices. But you can't usually edit vertices within an object on their own. So this is very helpful for moving around vertices. So I did exactly the same thing, just with a curve modifier. As you can see here. So let's say we have this curve, and if I want to change the middle, I can do Control H, hook to new object, and now moving this hook, you can see the curve is following over here. So that could be quite helpful if you need to animate a curve. Anyhow, that's how that is. So there's a minor detail as this swings. You can actually see the string in there, or the rope holding it moves as well, which is nice. This actually has, in its animation, I'm just remembering this project, this has a noise modifier, or it should have at least, on one of the locations or rotations. What there was, there you go, there's a noise modifier on the Y location, giving it a bit of jitter. This as it goes along, giving it an extra level of realism, which is nice. Okay, just to explain more about animation modifiers. So over here I have this sphere. You need to pull up the graph editor, as you can see over here, and you will need to have one keyframe. So let's just apply the location for now. Now, if I pick any of the X, Y, or Z locations, let's pick the Z. If I hit N to bring up the properties panel, then you can see there is a modifiers tab right to the right over here, and I can add a modifier. The ones they're all quite helpful. The ones most used are probably noise, cycles, maybe limits. For this demonstration, I'm going to show noise. And now you can see there's a bit of noise. So if I play the animation, you can see it shaking around. You can change the parameters over here to change the scale, so it's moving around slower, or the strength, so it's going to jump around a bit more. You can also restrict the frame range, so it's quite helpful to use this when you need a bit of randomness to an animation. The way these wheels are done, so there was a lot of smoke simulations that I have turned off for this demonstration because just the smoke cache itself was like 11 or 12 gigabytes, so I don't want that taking away frames from my viewport. But the way that these wheels were done, as you can see, they roll along. Also, there is a ground, which I'm guessing is on background. Yeah, so there's a ground, and they follow along. This ground actually has a displace modifier, as you can, or maybe one's already applied, but there should be some bumps, as you can see. And what I did was I took these wheels and this, and I parented them to an empty over here, as you can see. Now this empty has a shrink wrap so that it automatically sticks to the ground, which is nice. So as I move this whole RAM around, all the wheels automatically, as long as they stay above, if I do shift, if I do G shift Z and I move it around, you can see they're constantly sticking to the surface, which is a nice way to keep the wheels shrink wrapped to the surface. Actually, the way that the wheels turn is I use this big Suzanne head over here, and you can see if I move this monkey head up and down, if we zoom in, that turns the wheels. It's just easier using a driver like that. And then you can always just tweak the Z location to change the overall amount of turning, if you understand what I'm saying. All right, so let's explain the basics of drivers. As you can see here, we have a wheel, and let's say we want to add a Suzanne over here, and we want the Z location of the Suzanne to move the X location of the wheel. So the way we would do that is if you bring up the properties panel, you can right click on the X location and hit add driver. And now we're going to choose what object is going to be influencing the X axis of this wheel. So for that, we're going to hit the Suzanne. But because we haven't changed anything, the X location of the Suzanne will be the X location of the wheel. If we want to change that to have the Z location of the Suzanne change the X axis of the wheel, we would right click and in edit driver, instead of X location, you hit Z location. So now you can see as we change the Z location of the monkey Suzanne, the X location of the wheel changes. But if we want to have it, let's say, a lot more sensitive, we only want to move the Suzanne a tiny bit and we want the X location to move a lot more, we can change that over here in the expression. So right now it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So however much you move the drive object, the target object will move. But you can do, let's say we want 10 times the amount. So if we move the Suzanne head, the wheel will move 10 times. So it's a lot more sensitive, and you could obviously change that to the opposite. So instead of 10 times, we can do 0.1 times, and now it's going to be a lot less sensitive. And that's the basics of drivers. You can use that to affect the rotation scale, or honestly any parameter. You can right click and insert driver. So this is most of the RAM over here. And moving on. So the wall itself looked like this. This area was pretty much out of focus. It's just using project from view with a texture. You can see it's quite blurry. This I modeled from scratch. A lot of arrays going on over here. The reason why I did that is because there's a section in the middle over here. If I show that. So all of this was destroyed using the cell fracture modifier. I had to really go a lot of times to actually figure out the right settings for that. And then all of these had rigid body, so they can all fly out and explode on their own. So to just explain the basics of cell fracture, over here we have this ground. Let's add a rigid body and passive, and the object we want to destroy. Let's say we have this cylinder. Let's also give it a rigid body. So right now it's just going to fall down and hit the ground. That's all good. But if we want to slice this up, make sure you have the add-on enabled, and you're going to hit F3 and search for cell fracture. There's a lot of settings over here which you can mess around with. change them about noise and randomness, you're going to press OK, and it's going to take some time to destroy this. Give it a couple moments depending on what settings you choose. It could vary. And when it's done, you'll be left with a lot of tiny objects, and the original object will also be there. So you can delete that. And now you are left with all these broken objects over here. So what I would actually do is, if you haven't enabled them with rigid body, which you can see right now, they don't have rigid body, so nothing's happening. Instead of hitting each one and adding a rigid body, I actually just go and join them all up into one object. Now you can apply the rigid body, and now you can go to edit mode, hit P, and separate by loose parts. So now each of these are their own piece, but the issue is right now the origin point of them is wrong. So if you just select them all, you can right click, hit set origin to center of surface or volume, doesn't really make a difference. And now if you play the animation, you will see these will explode. The reason why they're exploding is because they're too close to each other, and you're going to have to mess around with some of the rigid body settings to fix that. But even now, you just have it exploding. It's kind of cool. It was annoying about the shading over here, but it is what it is. And then again, if we actually hide this, you can see I gave it some sort of jagged edges. These bricks, super helpful using the random object info, giving each one of them a unique color. Super helpful. Definitely use that if you have tons of bricks. I made them a bit bigger here because I didn't want too many rigid bodies flying around, because this was quite a complex and big project. This grass, I don't even know how I made it. It's probably a couple images. Yeah, it's a few images mixed together with a noise texture. You can probably see if we go to... No, that's just the normal. It's just one grass texture. Interesting. It seemed to be high res enough. Awesome. So that's the grass over there. Moving on to these castles. Now, they were actually also took a while to do. You can see there's nothing done on the roof over here because it's not seen. This was actually right at the end of the project, and it was quite complex. So what I did is I actually just copied it, moved to a new Blender file, did all the changes and everything I need, and then brought it back. So all of these hedges, they actually were a mesh at the beginning, and then I just added a plane with a transparent background. And if you rotate it around a few times, as you can see here, if I just let's scale this along the x-axis to be 0. So if we have something like this, as long as you shift D and rotate it along the z-axis, a few times, it's pretty much a 3D a 3D bush over there, as long as it's in the distance, and it only has how many vertices? It only has 12 vertices, so that's pretty efficient. Again, these textures, they were initially project from view, and I did all that, but then it turned out to be easier just to use a brick texture. So if you go to shading, you can see all the colors. In the game, the player color is around the area over here, so in case I needed to change that, I made that its own color. And you can always change this, which helps when things are procedural. There are also some lights inside giving it a nice glow, where from the camera view you can actually see, if we turn on render view, I'm not sure, yeah, it's not going to show, I don't have the lights showing, but that gives it a nice element that you can actually see through the windows because they are brighter. There's also super helpful, if you go to the towers, super helpful, where is it? Separate X, Y, Z, giving us this slightly darker top and bottom, really selling the effect. And you multiply that with the texture, and it just makes it darker at the top and bottom. Without it, it would just look like this, very uniform. Hello. There we go. It would just look like this, super uniform. So it's like there's no ambient occlusion or anything. So adding that separate X, Y, Z, it worked for this model. So that was quite helpful. I also took out a lot of the saturation. I put that to 0.5 because the lighting had a lot of hue, a lot of saturation to it. So that's the castle, simply duplicated over. All these things very basically modeled, as you can see, nothing too fancy because it is all in the distance. So that's these parts. The smoke simulation, there was one as this wall exploded, there was one massive one, and there was another one as the wheel skidded, as you can see, I'm just going to replay the animation. So you can see there how the two different smoke simulations incorporated the trees as well. Initially they were modeled, and that took way too much rendering time and it slowed everything down. So I did the same trick with the 3 planes. You could use 2. I found 3 to be the lucky number. It's just more reliable, but if you need to use 2, you can. Even for these ones all the way at the edge, they're literally just planes, because if you go to the camera view and we go to the end of the animation, I just had to fill out the area over here, and there's so much blur, nothing's really going to be noticed. We can add in the lights. There's a few lights on these trees to get them to fit in. A lot of specific lighting on the ram. A lot of that is actually following, or some of that. There's one main light. Where is it? There should be one light following the ram. Can't find it right now. Anyway, this is what the scene looks like. You can see it's quite bare when you're looking at it from this far out, but when you're down and close up, it's a lot more exciting. So this is playing through at real time, but obviously without the wall smashing, because then it would drop to a couple frames a minute, which is not what we want. But you can see there's a dip in the ground, and as I said before, you can see the wheels beautifully going in and then back up over here, and they're constantly following the ground. These arrows were super fun to add as well. They do have a bit of jiggle to them. So if you just follow this arrow over here, it goes in, and it has a bit of, you can see it has a bit of a wobble, has a few keyframes. They do all come in from pretty far out, but it's not too necessary. Actually, the way I probably just put them way far out over here. I don't even know where they are. Yeah, they're all the way up here, just out of the scene. I didn't want them too close, but again, these were quite simply modeled. If you look at them, let's just unhide everything. You can see just a cylinder with some feathers, and the tip doesn't even like link up, and it gets nicely embedded in the ground, which is helpful. Yeah, so this is pretty much it as a breakdown of this scene. There was a lot of iterations. I probably had, I think, maybe 80 or 90 different save versions of this. So I really enjoyed the way this turned out. Hopefully you enjoyed this breakdown process with a few tips thrown in. Make sure to subscribe and like the video if you want to see more of this, and have the most wonderful day.